a welcome addition. And with that, let me welcome you to another look into the life and message of Elizabeth Elliot. She called us to set a higher standard and not be satisfied with a little empty religion in our lives. As our series continues in the coming weeks, we'll hear from friends, from family, and others who were influenced by Elizabeth and the message she talked about and modeled. Hey, welcome again. It's good to have you with us. Well, today, as usual, we'll have two Gateway to Joy programs as we start a short series called Bringing Up Baby. We'll have a guest today. Elizabeth will be joined by her friend Arlita Winston. Today, it's when you're expecting and then when a second child is born. We'll be hearing from Elizabeth's only child, Valerie Elliot Shepard, as she talks about how her mother taught her to do a task. And Quinn Hood from the Elizabeth Elliot Foundation will be talking about her advice for young mothers in relation to Gateway to Joy. If you have children, you may be very familiar with the sense of inadequacy in knowing how to raise them. Today, Elizabeth's guest, Arlita Winston, together they talk about what to expect when you're expecting, about the wonder of having a child, about the fear that comes with it, about the process of feeling ready to even have kids. It's been said no parent is adequate to bring up a child.
You are loved with an everlasting love. This is God's word to us. He loves us, and underneath are His everlasting arms. This is your friend, Elizabeth Elliot, talking this week with my dear friend, Arlita Winston. Welcome, Arlita.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Arlita, you're the mother of how many children and how many grandchildren?
5 children and 16 grands.
I dare say that you've had a little experience in raising children and in helping your children raise their children. Before we get into all those wonderful and exciting and difficult things, could we talk a little bit about expecting a child?
I think it was one of the most joyful things that I had experienced in our marriage when I discovered that we were pregnant. And I know that from the time I was a child, the one thing I wanted to be more than anything else was a mother. And I thought when I was going through school, well, probably I would like to go into medicine. I would like to become a doctor or a nurse. And I started heading in that direction. But when I fell in love with Joe, and he is a doctor, and he said to me, well, I don't want to come home to a doctor. I want to come home to a wife and to a mother. I said, all right, that's what I'll do. And really deep inside, that was what I wanted to do more than anything else in all the world. To me, I felt that I was made for that.
What were your thoughts when you found out that you were pregnant?
I think mainly wonder that I was going to be able to have a child that would be part of me and part of Joe. I don't remember being scared at all at that time. It wasn't until I actually held that little one that fear seized me, and I wondered if I could do what I needed to do to bring up that child. But during the time I was carrying that baby, I was filled with wonder that this life was forming in me. And I remember coming very close to God during that time in my thinking and in my praying and my reading. I did a lot of reading from the Psalms, and especially the Psalm 139, where he talks about that our very substance is not hid from him, that he made us in secret. Starting in verse 14, I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. My substance was not hid from thee. And that was awesome to me, that God knew everything about that little one. As small as it was in my womb, he already had plans for that little one that I didn't know anything about, and that somehow I was wrapped up in these plans that God was planning for my little one. So it goes on and it says, "Thine eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect. And in thy book all my members were written, which in continuance were fashioned, when as yet there was none of them. How precious also are thy thoughts unto me, O God! How great is the sum of them." And I remember thinking, you mean God thinks I am precious? I had grown up all my life knowing that all people were precious to God. My parents had gone out as missionaries to win the lost to God. And so I knew all people were precious, but I don't know that I ever really understood that I alone, by myself, was precious to God until I read this chapter. And I realized how personal this was, that I was special, and that this baby was very, very special, and that he was creating this baby for something very special in his kingdom.
When do you think that baby's life began?
Oh, before I knew it was there. Just right from the very beginning.
At conception.
Oh, yes.
Did you ever think of that baby as anything other than a baby?
No. It was partly Joe and me.
Isn't it sad and interesting the way language changes and shapes the way we think? I think there's a strong movement to use the word fetus or tissue rather than the word baby. But I think, Arlita, I'm sure you'll agree with me in this, every woman who gets pregnant knows that what she's got inside of her is a baby. It's a baby. It's a human being, isn't it?
Yes. In fact, we started trying out names long before that baby came out. We talked about what name to give it.
You've never heard anybody go to a pregnant woman and say, well, how's the fetus doing? No. People do say, well, how's the little baby or something. And my producer-director, whose voice you don't hear, is Linda Myers. And she is thrilled to be also carrying a little one. So we're just thinking a lot these days about expectant mothers.
Well, I've had the joy recently of working with two young mothers. They aren't actually my own daughters, but they feel like daughters to me. They've both been pregnant this last year. And I've loved talking with them and finding out how they're feeling while they're carrying that new little one. And both of them seemed so astonished that they became weary. They couldn't do as much as they had wanted to do. They became frustrated. They cried more easily. All these things that are so different. And in fact, I can remember when I was first pregnant, Joe wondered if he had married the right person. I was just...
You were so miserable to get along with?
Well, I was so nauseous, and I couldn't eat, and I couldn't fix his good meals like he was expecting. And I had to come to the realization that everything had to slow down, and I had to concentrate on the fact that I was being prepared to be a mother, and I needed to shift gears. And it was a wonderful experience to use that time when I was sick and not feeling up to par to realize, hey, I really can't do just everything. I'm needing to shift all my gears because I am going to begin being a mother, which is going to take all my time in a very special, unique way for the next few years.
I had a young woman say to me, and she's not so young, she's actually 38 years old, and she said she doesn't really feel that she's ready to have a baby yet. She's been married about 3 years. I know that her parents are just in agonies of desire for grandchildren. And so my husband and I were talking with this lady and saying, are you considering the possibility of beginning a family? And she said, well, we just don't feel ready yet. Don't you think, Arlita, that no matter how ready or not ready one feels a week before you find out you're pregnant, when you find out you're pregnant, you realize that you probably have 7 or 8 months to get ready. I mean, you have 9 months to get ready, but of course you don't know the very moment you become pregnant. But those 7 or 8 months, isn't God preparing you to be a mother?
It's a process. It's a process, and you never really feel adequate to be ready.
I agree.
If you do feel adequate, I think you're in for a big shock, because you'll end up realizing there is just no parent who's adequate to bring up a child. We just are not able to do it, and that's why we need to lean so heavily. We need to crawl through our days on our knees before God for those children. Because just when you think you really know how to bring up a child, I know that my mother said that if she had just had one, my sister Andrea, she could have written her book on how to bring up a child. But then I was born, and it just blew all of her categories. And none of us are really ready or able. We have to lean. I think God has planned it that way so that we would lean on him, so that we would have to come to him and say, help.
Someone has said that children and animals are given to humble us. And I love what Lancelot Andrewes says in one of his prayers of thanksgiving. He thanks God for infants that sweeten the world. Isn't that lovely? But I certainly agree with what you're saying about the sense of inadequacy that comes. The day my daughter was born, I was in tears saying, Lord, there is no way that I can raise this child, that I can mother this child as she ought to be mothered and as I want to mother her. The sense of huge, overwhelming responsibility that here is a living soul, a living body here on earth for whom no one is responsible but me and my husband. It was a lesson in God's just speaking to me and saying, no, you can't do it. You're not ready. You're not adequate. But I'm going to help you. He is our helper.
You know, my mother was a wonderful example to me in this. She never pretended to be adequate. She was forever saying, if we did something wrong, she'd say, oh, you got that from me. Those are my bad bits. But she was quick to recognize her frailties, and she was quick to share them with us. At the same time, she spoke with an authority, and we knew that she was speaking from God. But she didn't pretend that she was totally adequate.
Thank you so much, Arlita Winston.
When You're Expecting, Bringing Up Baby, Part 1. We'll have Part 2 in just a little bit when a second child is born. But right now, let's hear from Elizabeth's daughter, Valerie Elliot Shepard. What did Elizabeth teach her?
When we actually moved to the States, everything practical had to be done well. I had to wash the dishes well, thoroughly. I could not waste water. I had to turn off lights when I was finished in a room. I had to dust even the baseboards, the edges and the windowsills. Everything had to be thoroughly done. And I'm very thankful that she taught me that. But always teaching spiritual truths, especially not to live by our feelings, which is, of course, what she and my dad had to constantly remind themselves as they had given up their hearts to Christ, and they were willing to go, even if they weren't positive, willing to go to Ecuador, even if they didn't know when or if they would get married. But it was in that last year in Ecuador, when they were 6 months learning Spanish together, that they were more and more convinced that someday God would bring them together. And amazingly, my father even said to her, it might be another 5 years before we can get married, because he was so sure that he'd have to live in the jungle by himself, or at least with another male missionary. But the Lord opened the way for them to get married in October of 1953.
Valerie Elliot Shepard. Later on, we'll think about the difference between Elizabeth through her books and Elizabeth through her speaking. Does it have a different impact, one versus the other, written or spoken? Right now, though, think about the time when a baby is born. Oh, this new child may be taking over. Consider the molly grumps and the change in dynamics when number 2 comes along. And here's a question. Can a 2-year-old really learn things? Is it worth trying to teach that young one?
When that baby is born, life changes, doesn't it?
Entirely.
Rather drastically?
Your entire life changes.
You've learned many lessons through raising your 5 children. What would you like to tell us today?
I think one of the greatest joys right now is watching those 5 children raise their children. And just before Christmas, I went out to spend a week with my youngest son and his wife, Sam and Darcy, and they gave birth to their second baby. It's one thing to give birth to your first and to be able to put all your attentions on that first, but somehow the second one just blows you away. You don't have that time with that first one that you always have had, and you have to nurse the second one, and the first one doesn't know why in the world they're being displaced. And when I went out to Sam and Darcy's home, that was the situation. Dear little Karis, 2 years old, was furious that Caleb had entered her world, and he needed to be fed and attended to, and I watched Darcy and Sam struggle. Before I went out there, I determined I was not going to offer any advice. Not any, and that if I did say anything, it would be because they dragged it out of me. And I kept true to my promise. I went out, and I just did all I could do to help, but pretty soon my precious daughter-in-law, Darcy, said, "Mom, what do you do about Karis? She won't let me go. I'm trying to nurse Caleb. What do I do?" Well, I let her ask that a few times before I gave any answer. And the reason was not because I just wanted to be a good mother-in-law. It was because I really didn't know. And I had to ask the Lord, what? And I'm learning as a mother-in-law that the things that worked for me with my children are not always going to work with your daughter-in-law. You're working with different people, different children, different spouses, and I'm learning that I don't have that answer. But what I do know is that God will listen to me, and that I can come and talk to God about that problem, and that very same God who helped me with Sarah and Joe and Brad and Stan and Sam is going to help them with their children. And so my time was spent mainly praying and asking God to show them what to do. A really fun thing happened. Little Karis, who was 2, had just been moved into her little youth bed, and she knew she was having to give up her crib for baby Caleb. And now was the big trial. We were going to see if she would actually stay in that youth bed for her nap. And I was on the phone to my husband that evening, and I said, "Joe, pray. Just pray for little Karis tonight, because she's going to have to sleep in that little bed, and tomorrow she's going to have her nap in there, and I don't know that she's going to actually stay there for the whole time that she's supposed to, so just please pray for her." So Joe laughed, and he said, "I sure will." He said, "I'll tell you what you would have done if it had been yours." And I said, "What?" And he said, "We would have both stood outside that door, and we would have waited for any noise whatsoever, and immediately opened the door and addressed her with, 'Get back into bed. You do not get out of bed.' And you would have been very quiet, and you would have been very firm, but you would not have left that door. You would have stayed there if it had taken you 2 hours to do it." And I laughed, and I said, "Yeah, that's exactly what I'd do." And he said, "Well, are you going to tell Darcy how to do it?" And I said, "No." So the next day, Karis was put down for her nap. And I had gone out for a bit, came back in, and Darcy said, "Oh, Mother, it worked." And I said, "What worked?" And she said, "I had this great idea. Sam and I would stand outside the door, and we would just wait for the least sound from that child, and we would immediately pounce on it immediately until she got the message. That is where she was supposed to stay." I burst out laughing. I said, "Oh, I'm so thankful I didn't say a word," because it was Darcy's own idea that God had given to her.
In answer to Joe's prayer.
In answer to Joe's prayer. But it was beautiful. Then she turned to me and she said, "Now, what do I do with Caleb? He's in the middle of the night." And here now it was Darcy asking the questions, which I thought was so I have to say it was very precious, and I felt like I was on holy ground, because it can't be easy for a daughter-in-law to ask a mother-in-law how to do something with their child. It can't be easy. And so I was handling it very precious and honestly a holy occasion. And so I prayed while she was asking me the question. And she said, "What do I do? Caleb wakes up during the night, and I just hear all of his snufflings constantly, and I can't go back to sleep. And it's like we're up all night feeding him, all night long." And after I heard the whole story, I said, "Well, why wouldn't you put him in the farthest bedroom where you'll still hear him when he cries, but you won't hear all those snuffling noises to begin with, where he's just waking himself up, and you'll sleep longer until he gets completely wakened, and then he'll give a good bellow, you'll go and feed him, but then you'll put him back down and let him get a good sleep. You won't just try to have him next to you all the time where you're trying to meet every one of his needs." I just don't feel that mother can meet every one of those needs, and that baby needs some time of quiet to himself.
Now, I'm interested to know, Arlita, what did happen about Darcy's question about Karis, who was jealous of this new baby and didn't understand why she had been displaced.
Well, she and I talked it over of different ways that she could go while she was nursing Caleb, so that the attention could be put right on Karis, so that Karis could share in that warm closeness of that nursing time. And I suggested that she cuddle Karis up next to her, her little 2-year-old, and read to her while she was nursing little Caleb. And I think that helped a certain degree. I also told Darcy that this was not going to just happen overnight, that this child had been solely her preoccupation for the last 2 years, and that Karis herself was going to have to learn some lessons, and that she could learn them at 2 years old. The fact that there were other people in her family and in her life that she would need to share life with, and that she was going to have to learn this and not go into a pout, not go into an angry tantrum.
I think it's almost impossible for young parents today, most of them, to believe that you can teach a 2-year-old any lessons. The lesson of this is your bed, and this is where you're going to sleep at night, and this is where you're going to take your nap, and the lesson of you cannot have 100% of your mommy's time now because we have another baby. But you're telling us that lessons can be taught.
Absolutely, and especially attitudes. And this is where Sam and Darcy are working on with little Karis. Her attitude, she doesn't need to go into a pout when she doesn't get her way. I reminded them of that little poem that I had brought our children up on. "Here's sulky Sue, what shall we do? Turn her face to the wall till she comes to." And Sam and Darcy had been concerned that they were punishing her too much. And I said, well, let's vary the punishment. Let's not always do the same thing over and over again, but let's relate the attitude to the punishment. So I suggested that instead of just standing her in the corner, that they make a face of sulky Sue and pin it to the wall. And she was to go and just stand there in the corner with her nose against sulky Sue's nose. But on the other side, to draw a very cheerful face. And that when Karis was ready to be cheerful, that she got to turn over that face on the wall and run and play and do what she was wanting to do. But that she herself needed to identify with sulky Sue, and that she was just going to have to put her face to the wall until she came to. Well, it worked like magic. And the child, when she began going into the mully grumps, on her own decided to go put her face to the wall till she came to.
That's wonderful. I really think that's an inspired idea. Obviously, one of God's answers to your prayer. Mm-hmm. My mother used to say, I don't like that face. You go into that little room there and shut the door until you find a nice face. but I love the idea of a drawing of a sulky Sue and then cheerful Sue.
Mm-hmm.
Some young parents, Arlita, try to bribe their children before this baby is born, and they lavish gifts on them. Is that a good idea?
I think that a child, even though they're just 2 years old, can learn responsibility. If you give a child gifts and lavish them on, how long are you going to continue doing these gifts? And when are you going to stop giving these gifts? When is the child going to learn? You might as well start right from the start, giving them a picture that they can understand of the wonder and the wonderfulness of the family getting larger. Part of the problem might stem from the parents themselves not being sure if they want a larger family, and so they indulge the older child. And I think that the sooner the better of helping that 2-year-old to accept that there are other children in the family and to be able to give to that baby.
And the great lesson that the universe does not revolve around me.
Right.
Bringing Up Baby Part 2, When a Second Child is Born. Quinn Hood serves with the Elizabeth Elliot Foundation, and she talked about the difference between reading the books of Elizabeth and hearing her speak.
I began reading her books in college, and I think once I actually heard her speak, I think probably A Gateway to Joy, her image really softened in my mind, because in her books, she was exactly the voice of wisdom that I needed to hear, but sometimes she came across as, I don't want to say harsh, Mike, but just really direct. And then I think hearing her voice, especially as she was speaking a lot in her older age, just really softened her image in my mind. And so I love to hear her speak now, especially Gateway to Joy programs. I feel like those are so impactful because they're short, but so rich. I tell other young mothers like me, just listen to A Gateway to Joy a day, just click on one while you're doing dishes or whatever. It will really bless you, because she just shares such depth in just, 10 minutes, 15 minutes?
That was Quinn Hood. Well, as our time comes to an end, thanks for letting us come into your home, maybe joining you at the office. Maybe you took a walk and we came along with you. On behalf of the Elizabeth Elliot Foundation, in cooperation with the Bible Broadcasting Network, let me invite you to check out elizabethelliot.org. You'll find more Gateway to Joy programs, videos, and more. elizabethelliot.org. Hey, if you get a chance, leave a review for us sometime wherever you found this program. Thanks. Well, until next time, may God remind you each and every day, you are loved with an everlasting love, and underneath are the everlasting arms.